The man from the co-op pulled his truck to a stop at the edge of Vera Pitman's property and sat there for a long moment before he climbed down. He had driven 40 minutes out of his way to get here. That was not something he did for just anyone. But he had heard things. He stepped through the gate, looked out across the field, and said nothing for a while. Then he turned to the woman standing beside him and said, quietly, that he owed her an apology. She told him she didn't need one. She meant it. Vera Pitman was 41 years old when her marriage ended and she was left with the property on Cutter Road. The house needed work. The well pump had been failing for 2 seasons, and the back 40 acres, the ones her ex-husband had always called the problem acres, were sodden half the year and cracked hard as ceramic the other half. The lawyer had been straightforward about it. Her husband got the equipment. She got the land. Most people in town assumed that was his way of winning, even in the settlement. What could a woman alone do with 40 acres of ground that didn't know whether it wanted to be a marsh or a desert? Her neighbor to the east, a retired feed supplier named Walt Coombs, told her over the fence one afternoon that she might consider selling to the Harrington family, who had been looking to expand their cattle operation. He said it kindly. He was a kind man, but he said it the way people say things when they have already made up their mind what the answer should be. She thanked him and went back inside. That was the spring of 1976. What nobody in Cutter Road understood, what they could not have understood because she had told no one, was that Vera had been watching the back 40 for almost a decade. Not casually. She had been watching it the way a person watches something they intend to understand completely, which is a different kind of watching altogether. She had walked it in February, when the water table rose and the low sections pooled. She had walked it in August, when the clay cracked and the grass went yellow. She had pressed her fingers into the soil in spring and noted the color change, the smell, the way moisture moved through the layers. She had a composition notebook from the hardware store in town, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, and in it she had recorded everything. Dates, temperatures, water depth in the low sections, which plants came back each year and which ones didn't, what the robins did versus what the red-winged blackbirds did. Tiny observations that would have meant nothing to anyone looking at any single page, but which, read together over years, told a story she was fairly certain no one else had thought to read. The land was not broken. The land was being misread. The low sections retained water longer than anyone realized. Not 2 weeks after a hard rain, the way her husband had always complained. More like 6. Sometimes 8, and the mineral content of the soil. She had sent samples off to the University Extension Office twice in the 1970s. Paying out of her own grocery money was better than anything the Harrington cattle acres could claim. She had read everything she could get her hands on. Soil chemistry, water retention, aquaculture, things people in Cutter Road had no reason to be reading about. She had been thinking about crawfish for 2 years before she actually did anything about it. The morning she drove to meet the supplier in Decatur, she left before 6 so she wouldn't have to answer questions. Her daughter, Tina, was staying with her that week, and Tina had a way of asking questions that were really statements wearing a thin disguise. Questions like, "Are you sure this is the right time, Mom? And have you really thought through the cost?" Tina was 22 and careful. She had gotten careful from her father's side of the family, and Vera did not hold it against her. The supplier's name was Gideon Marsh. He operated out of a low metal building on the south edge of Decatur, and he raised his eyebrows only slightly when Vera told him what she was looking for. "Crawfish," he said. "Red swamp," she said. "I want to start with a pound of juvenile stock per acre." I'm working with 31 viable acres to start. He wrote the number down. Then he looked up at her. You've done this before? She said she hadn't. He scratched the back of his neck. He told her what she already knew. That crawfish farming in this part of the state was unusual. That the climate could be tricky. That there were things that could go wrong. He wasn't trying to discourage her, he said. He just wanted her to have realistic expectations. She told him. She appreciated that, and then she told him her soil pH, her water retention numbers, the average temperature variance between her low sections and her high sections across the last 4 years, and the species of aquatic vegetation already establishing itself naturally in the pooled areas. She read from the composition notebook, which she had brought. She read it the way someone reads from a report they have prepared. Unhurried, precise, with no apology in her voice. Gideon Marsh did not scratch the back of his neck again. When do you want delivery? He said. She had the stock transferred on a Tuesday in April. She had arranged to borrow Walt Coombs's flatbed for the day, which he had agreed to with no questions, because Walt was the kind of man who didn't ask questions he suspected might get long answers. She drove through town on the way back to Cutter Road. It was early afternoon, and the hardware store parking lot had the usual collection of trucks, belonging to the usual collection of men who could often be found there between noon and 3. A man named Earl Stuckey, who ran a small grain operation on Route 9, was standing outside with 2 other men she recognized but did not know well. Earl saw her drive past with the tank on the flatbed. He said something to the others. She saw it in her rearview mirror, the way he tilted his head toward the road, and the others turned to look, and then one of them laughed. She had expected this. She had prepared herself for it. What she had not prepared herself for, what she realized only later, sitting in the cab of the truck at the edge of her own property, was the particular quality of the silence that followed. Not her silence. The silence of the land, the back 40 acres stretching out in the low afternoon light, the water standing in the low sections, the red-winged blackbirds doing what they did. The land had been waiting. She had been waiting, and now neither of them had to wait anymore. She climbed out of the cab and got to work. The first season was not a disaster, which was more than she had hoped for. She lost some stock to a late cold snap in May. She had anticipated losing some stock. She had budgeted for it. She had also anticipated the part where her daughter called in July to ask if she wanted to reconsider the scale of the operation. And she had prepared her answer for that too, which was short and left no room for follow-up questions. She kept records through everything, not just the notebook now. She had started a second notebook, this one dedicated entirely to water temperature and stock behavior. She walked the fields every morning before breakfast, in rubber boots, sometimes in the dark in the early weeks when she had trouble sleeping. She adjusted the water flow. She moved the vegetation barriers she had constructed from PVC pipe and wire mesh. She made small corrections, constantly, the way a person tends a living thing that cannot tend itself. The neighbors noticed she was out there. They noticed the way July. They noticed the way you notice something odd that you can't quite categorize, the way you notice a tree growing at an unusual angle. You don't stop your car to study it. You just file it somewhere in the back of your mind. Earl Stuckey mentioned her to someone at the feed store. She heard about it later. What he had said was not mean, exactly. It was worse than mean. It was dismissive. He had said something about the Pitman widow and her fish pond and the fact that some people just needed to learn their lessons the expensive way. She heard this and felt something she recognized as useful anger, the kind that doesn't waste itself on expression, the kind that turns inward and becomes very quiet and very focused and gets things done. By the second season, she had made back her initial investment in stock. Not a profit, not yet. But the numbers in the notebook told her what direction she was moving, and the direction was right. She applied for a small business development loan that fall. The loan officer at the bank in town was a man named Phil Graber, who had a gentle, careful manner, and who asked her, with genuine curiosity, what exactly she was farming. She explained. He nodded. He asked several intelligent questions, which she respected. Then he told her, also gently, that the bank's experience with aquaculture lending in the region was limited, and that there would need to be additional documentation of projected returns. She brought him the documentation. She had already prepared it. She had projected 3 scenarios: conservative, moderate, and optimistic, with different assumptions for weather, stock survival rates, and market price per pound. She had researched the restaurant wholesale market in the 3 nearest cities. She had contacted 2 distributors and received preliminary expressions of interest in writing. Phil Graber looked at the folder for a long time. "Mrs. Pitman," he said, "I don't get submissions like this very often." She got the loan. The hard season was the 3rd one, not hard because of the weather, though the weather that spring was difficult. Hard because of Tina. Her daughter had moved back to the area the previous fall, which was supposed to be a good thing, and it was, mostly. But Tina had taken up a habit of stopping by on Sunday afternoons with her boyfriend, a man named Davis, who worked in insurance and who had opinions about things. Not mean opinions. Considered opinions. Delivered in the tone of a man who had learned that wrapping advice in questions made it easier to give. One Sunday, in March, Davis stood at the fence line, looking out at the flooded low sections. They were between cycles, and the fields looked more like a shallow lake than a farm. And he asked Vera, in his careful way, whether she had considered that the operation might be at a natural ceiling, whether the infrastructure costs of scaling up might outpace the returns, whether she had talked to anyone, maybe a financial advisor, about exit strategies. Vera looked at him. She looked at Tina, who was looking at her boots. "Davis," she said, "I'm going to pour some coffee. You're welcome to come in if you'd like." She walked back to the house. She did not discuss exit strategies. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with both notebooks and went through every number again. Not because she was uncertain. She was not uncertain. She did it because there is a kind of work that is also a kind of prayer, and it was that kind of night. The numbers said what the numbers had always said. She was moving in the right direction. She had always been moving in the right direction. She just had to keep moving. There was a moment in the 4th season that she did not write down in either notebook. She was not a person who made a habit of recording her private feelings, which she considered her own business. But she thought about it afterward many times, in the way you think about moments that do not announce themselves as important until they have already passed. She was in the south field in the early morning, just after a warm front had come through. The water was the temperature it needed to be. The stock was visible near the surface in the low light, moving the way they move when the conditions are exactly right. Purposeful, calm, numerous. She stood there and looked at it, and felt something she did not have a ready word for. Not pride. Something older than pride. Something that had to do with paying attention for a long time and being proven right, and understanding that being proven right was not actually the most important part. The paying attention was the most important part. The paying attention was the whole thing. She stood there until the light changed. Then she went back to work. The man from the Wheatland Distributors Cooperative was named Alan Foss. He had been in the distribution business for 23 years. He drove a clean white truck and wore a clean white shirt. And he had the careful, observant manner of a man who had learned that the fastest way to make a bad deal was to look too eager. He had heard about the Pitman operation from a restaurant buyer in Springfield who had been asking around for a reliable regional crawfish supplier. The buyer had called the co-op. The co-op had asked their people. 2 different people had said the same name. Foss called ahead. He said he'd like to come by and see the operation if she didn't mind. Vera said she didn't mind. He drove out to Cutter Road on a Thursday morning in October. He parked by the gate and sat for a moment before he climbed out, because that was his habit when he was assessing a situation. He looked at the property. He looked at the water. He looked at the low sections, which were in full production cycle. And he could see even from the fence that the density was right, that the operation was healthy, that someone had known exactly what they were doing for a long time. He walked the fields with her for an hour. He asked questions. She answered them. She showed him both notebooks. He was quiet for a while after that. "I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Pitman," he said. "I wasn't sure what I was going to find out here." She said she understood. "I owe you something," he said. He didn't specify what. He didn't need to. She told him she didn't need anything except a fair contract and a reliable schedule. They talked about terms for another 40 minutes, standing in the field, while the red-winged blackbirds went about their business in the cattails at the edge of the south section. She had terms prepared. She had known for some time what a fair contract looked like. She had done her research. When Foss drove back down the road toward the highway, she watched the truck until it disappeared. Then she went back to the house, opened the composition notebook, the original one, the first one with the marbled black and white cover, and wrote the date and the terms and the name of the company in her usual even handwriting. Below that, she wrote one thing that was not a number or a measurement or a name. She wrote, "The land knew. I just had to listen long enough." Then she closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf where it lived, and she went to start dinner, because there was always something that needed doing. Earl Stuckey stopped her outside the hardware store the following spring. He was not a bad man, and she had never thought of him as one. He had done what most people do, which was to look at a situation quickly, assume he understood it, and form a conclusion that was not worth very much. He told her he had heard about the Wheatland contract. He said he thought it was something. He used the word impressive, which she could tell he meant sincerely, and which cost him something to say. She thanked him and meant it. She did not say, "I told you so." She had never needed to say things like that. The field said it every morning when she walked them. The notebook said it on every page. The check from the co-op said it every quarter in numbers that were clear and straightforward and did not require interpretation. She had learned long ago that the most satisfying answer to a dismissal was not an argument. It was just to keep going. To pay attention when no one else was paying attention. To do the work. On the mornings when the work felt impossible, and on the mornings when it felt like nothing at all, and on the mornings when the light came across the water in that particular way. And she thought to herself, quietly, that she was glad she had not listened to anyone. Tina called on a Sunday evening in the fall, after the second Wheatland contract had been signed. A 3-year agreement, better terms than the first. She called to say that she was proud of her. She said it simply, without her usual qualifications. Vera thanked her. "Did you always know it was going to work?" Tina asked. Vera thought about it. She thought about the first notebook. The first walk through the south field with her boots soaking through. The morning she sat in the truck in the parking lot of the extension office because she was not sure she was doing the right thing, and then went in anyway. "No," she said. but I always knew the land was right. I just had to trust what I'd seen. There was a pause on the line. "Mom," Tina said, "I should have said that sooner." Vera told her it was all right, and it was. The composition notebook is still on the shelf in the kitchen, the original one. There are 7 of them now, lined up in order, and she could read any of them and tell you exactly what the South Field was doing on any given morning of any given year. That is what those notebooks represent. Not a record of success, exactly, but a record of attention, of choosing, day after day, to look closely at something most people had already written off. The back 40 on Cutter Road is not a problem anymore. Walt Coombs, who still lives to the east and who never did sell her out to the Harrington family, told her last summer that the property was looking the best he had ever seen it. He said it like a man who is genuinely happy to be wrong. She thanked him and went back to work, because the work did not wait. It never had.